The first atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima.
Oh, the humanity!
The fires of frustration and discord are burning in every
Let us
city.
not forget for a moment the toils and efforts that lie ahead.
They say that those who forget their history are condemned to repeat it. This is the History Lessons Podcast with certified financial planning practitioner Patrick Huey, author of History Lessons for the Modern Investor, and your guide to financial wisdom in the past, present, and future. You ready? Good. Let's get historical.
Historical indeed. This is the History Lessons Podcast, and I'm Patrick Huey, author of History Lessons for the Modern Investor. And in this episode, we're talking with the author of The Wolves and the Greyhounds, Robert Schreiner. Now, he's a former CIA intelligence officer who works as a consultant and executive in the global private security industry, but he's also an avid amateur military historian who's traveled the world and routinely sneaks in side trips to visit ancient fortifications and battlefields. He and his very patient wife live in the Blue Ridge Mountains of Tennessee. The Wolves and the Greyhounds is his first novel, but it sure doesn't read like a first novel. He's got the details down, as you might expect of a former intelligence officer. And we spend some time talking about his methods and sources, for his writing at least, and about the Battle of Coronel, which was a First World War naval battle that led to an Imperial German Navy victory over the Royal Navy on 1 November 1914. Interestingly, it took place off the coast of central Chile near the city of Coronel. We also talk about the Battle of the Falklands, which took place in December of 1914, where you could say the British Empire struck back. Now, I was completely ignorant of both of these battles. So, like with all good historical fiction, I learned something while I was pulled along by the plot, the details, and by the way, the excellent writing. And yes, in the end, there are 3 lessons for the modern investor from The Wolves and the Greyhounds. Let's get started. Well, I got to tell you, I enjoyed the book, and that's not me blowing smoke just because you're here on the podcast. I enjoyed it very much. I will be putting in my 5-star review later today on Amazon. So congratulations. And one of the reasons that I really enjoyed it is because you cover a period in time that I thought I knew something about, and it turned out I knew nothing. And for a guy who was in the Navy for 9 years to just not even realize that these battles took place is a little bit revealing for me. You know, now I know what I don't know, and it's quite a bit. But just talk to me a little bit about how you came across this story and what your process was to get it into print, because I mean, it's not a short book, and it's extremely well researched. So I'm imagining that this took you some time.
Oh, absolutely. And interestingly, my experience with it was similar to yours in that I had, I've always considered myself to be a bit of an amateur military historian.
Yeah.
I did work for the government in a military analysis role. I'm certainly familiar with it. I had assignments where I was assigned with the Navy, and all of that background, I also had never encountered these battles or knew much about them.
Yeah.
So the real backstory was when our kids were in high school, they they're all right in a row in school year. So they all had the same freshman history teacher at the same high school. And that particular history teacher had an exercise that he had all of his students go through. And it was an exercise about the First World War. And the goal was for all the students to write a journal as if they were a participant in the First World War in some capacity. They could have been a soldier, they could have been a nurse, they could have been a politician, they could have been, someone working behind the scenes. And it could be on any facet of the war. But the goal was to convey this story from a personal point of view, and doing so, learn more about it. And his reasoning behind this was the teacher's reasoning behind this assignment was that the First World War, in many ways, built much of the modern world that we now sort of understand. A lot of the modern borders were crafted as a result of the First World War. It really was, in many ways, the beginning of the end of colonialism, and so a lot of the countries that we now know as countries didn't even exist before the First World War. They were a colonial possession or whatever it might be. And so because of the impact that the First World War had, this teacher wanted them to really focus on it. And, a lot of, when people think about, big wars, they're much more focused on the Second World War.
Sure.
And it was, and versus what happened in the First World War. So with that as the backstory, all of our kids had to go through this process. And their nerdy dad, with all of his old dusty war books, suddenly was useful for these teenagers decided I was actually useful for something. And I was able to give them some of these resources for them to look at. And as part of that process, I was going through some of these books to make sure that it might be applicable to whatever their particular take on this project was. And in one of the books, just this kind of quick, almost one paragraph real mention was about the Battle of Coronel. And I read through and I thought, I've never heard of that. And I read a little bit more, and it just kind of stuck with me. And so second kid comes around and we're doing the same thing. And it really just stuck in my head that I really wanted to learn more about this because it was such an unusual circumstance. Why would a naval battle in the First World War take place off the coast of Chile? I mean, that just didn't make any sense at first. And then I did more research, and the more that I read about it, the more it just stuck in my head that this story is obscure enough that I'd never heard of it, but it was a big deal at the time. And it just begged me to retell it. The more and more I researched it, the more I became convinced that I wanted to tell this story in an accessible way. And there certainly have been books and other articles written about these events and nonfiction type things, but I wanted to write it in a way that I could really kind of get into the heads of the characters and really kind of convey what they were thinking and feeling and tell the story from both perspectives in a way that, again, was more accessible. And so I really, really became, convinced that I had to write this as a novel. So to your point, it really did require a lot of research. You hear the adage that you should write what you know. Well, nobody living right now was a First World War naval officer, and so that would be difficult to do. And in my limited experience with naval operations and things like that, certainly wasn't enough either. I needed to really dig into this topic and all of the research. So I embarked on what ultimately became about a 3-year journey of just researching.
Yeah.
And I reached out, thank goodness, the internet allowed all of this. I mean, in a different era, this wouldn't have been possible without a lot of travel. I did a little bit of travel. I went to the Hoover Institution at Stanford, and there were some places where I was able to go in person. But I was able to reach out, for example, to the Royal Naval College and UCLA's their kind of archivists and all these places where these were things that had sat on a dusty shelf in some cases for a century, perhaps.
Yeah.
And one of the things that was really striking to me was, and humbling and gratifying, was how many people were so gracious with their time and were excited that I was working on this project and were very happy to help me out with it. So I had people all over the world, from Germany and Great Britain and Australia and South America, who were sending me, just research materials. And this, everything from ship's rosters, personal logs, captain's logs, journals, books, articles, newspaper, newspaper clippings, from the 1914. All of these things were just an extraordinary trove of information. And in many cases, again, these had just been sitting somewhere, either digitally or physically on a shelf, without anyone having looked at them or thought about them in decades, if not longer.
Yeah.
And that was fascinating. And so, and the more that I learned about it, the more it just was more and more compelling. And part of that process was also fascinating in that, just as you would, we've come to understand now that if let's say some event happens and the reporters or police interview it's the 6 witnesses to the event, you're going to get 6 different accounts of what actually happened. The person was wearing a red hoodie, the person was wearing a black hoodie, it was whatever it was, right?
You might even get more than 6, but yeah.
Exactly, you might. So in this particular case, the same kind of idea where all these events were witnessed by multiple people. And German, British, in some cases, they were Chilean or Argentinian, or Brazilian, or whoever it might be, that were recording these events in some fashion or another. And there were so many different perspectives, and some of it you could chalk up to politics or agenda at the time. Some of it, hey, the British are going to have a different take on this than the Germans would have.
Sure.
But some of it was, without even an agenda, there were very clear differences in perspective. And so part of my job as, author, trying to pull all of this together and, create this narrative and this story arc that covered these events was I'd have to, in some cases, I would choose the version of the story that made most sense for the narrative. In some cases, I was able to do this, really fascinating thing where I could show a slightly different perspective from one, viewer to another. And that was another really fun part of this, was writing this same story from 2 perspectives, because it essentially is 2 books that, essentially that occasionally interweave. And so you've got Captain Luce's story on the British side, and you have Captain Merker's story on the German side. And I wanted to follow their stories as much as possible. And sometimes their view of the events was slightly different from each other.
Sure.
And that was a really fun exercise, to be able to tell this story from 2 different perspectives and then have those perspectives clash literally and figuratively.
Well, it's interesting you mentioned that, because one of the notes that I took from the book is Von Spee actually says this in the book. He says, "In my experience, the truth, if told at all, is the last story to be heard." And that sounds exactly like what you're talking about, as far as there are going to be 6 different sides to this story. Eventually, the truth will come out, hopefully, but it might take some digging. And I also thought that was a pretty profound statement, and also one that a former intelligence officer might just make.
Possibly so, and that was part of this, is that we're talking about a different era, and I think we've come to almost take for granted a lot of the modern technologies that we enjoy right now, and to a uneducated observer, a World War I warship would look superficially much like one in World War II. I mean, they're steel, they're large, they've got exhaust funnels, they have turreted guns. They in a lot of ways very similar, but there were very fundamental differences. I mean, this is an era before voice-to-voice radio.
Yeah.
They had to use the equivalent of Morse code, essentially, to encode a message, send it, decode it on the other side. It certainly was not a very rapid way of communicating. And so if they weren't using wireless, they were using flag signals, so they were using signal lamps. And then those things still exist, but they are used in a much different way than they were back then.
Yeah.
And they didn't have radar, and so it was still possible back in that era to escape a battle by slinking off into the night under the cover of darkness. That wouldn't have been the case in the Second World War. You could still hunt somebody down using radar in the Second World War, and you could use aircraft and other things that didn't exist in the First World War. And then they were also steam-powered ships. These were coal-fueled, steam-powered ships that had to actually carry tons of coal on board, and they had to refuel and shovel all this coal on board. And so the part of what happened is that there was a lot of isolation. These commanders, they would operate under extraordinary isolation from their command and control apparatus, whatever that might be. It would be difficult to get messages to and from their commanders back at either the Admiralty in Great Britain or the Admiralstab in Berlin. So that disconnect between those folks in the field and the folks who are supposedly pulling the strings back home resulted in great gulfs of potential miscommunication and all kinds of other things. And so that idea of telling a story and whose side and what kind of a truth is there, after the Battle of Coronel, for example, it was weeks before the world really knew what actually happened. And so there were all kinds of misinformation going on. There was fake news even back then. And so that part, that was a huge thing. Just the difficulty in communicating both tactically as well as strategically and globally was a huge challenge for them to overcome.
Yeah, I think you did a really good job in the book highlighting what you just talked about, which was the change in technology. And you mentioned, the kid's history teacher basically said World War I was kind of the dawn of modernity. And I think that comes through in the book because you're talking about, I think it's Luce who is talking about, that used to be the fastest armored cruiser afloat. That was just 13 years ago. Might as well have been 113 years. Technology was changing so rapidly at that point. It was very easy for, even a ship that was 13 years old to become an antique. And that change in technology really has just accelerated, like you said, into the modern world.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, nowadays you talk about fifth generation and sixth generation fighter jets, and that kind of a thing, and that's a huge issue in terms of the rapid advances of technology. Well, to your point, it was an arms race back then as well, and the two global powers at the time were Great Britain and Germany. And they were in an arms race that not only featured land forces and artillery and whatever the typical land technology that you would deal with. That was when the first tanks were developed and all those types of things. But it was also certainly in the naval world, and because the Royal Navy really did rule the seas at the time, Germany understood that they had to do something to counter that immense imbalance of power. And Germany had a relatively robust collection of colonies themselves. They had colonies in the Far East, they had colonies in the Pacific, they had colonies in Africa. And so they needed a naval presence that could protect and help resupply those colonies, but also offset the power of the Royal Navy. And so that was their goal. Now, at the outset of the First World War, there was still a great imbalance in, the Royal Naval, dominance hadn't been eroded completely, but Germany had some extraordinary advances. In fact, at the time of the beginning of the war, their kind of gun technology and artillery technology was more advanced than Great Britain's. Their guns were simply better, and so then that actually played out in these battles and in subsequent battles as well, where even bigger guns on the British side were being outranged by smaller guns on the German side. And so their shipbuilding technology was very robust. I mean, all of those ships took immense amounts of punishment before they sank. And the idea that you could have a one and done hit and a ship goes down actually didn't happen. I mean, at least in these battles, it simply didn't happen. These ships were struck dozens of times before they actually sank. And so, a testament to probably a little bit of over-engineering, but they really were trying to better the previous technologies, but also they were in a race with each other, thinking that ultimately there would be this clash.
I want to back up a little bit to the Admiralty. Because you brought that up previously. And of course, in World War I, the Admiralty was Winston Churchill.
It was.
which I think is an interesting twist. And the commentary in the book is very often, what the hell is Churchill thinking? What is going on at the Admiralty right now that they aren't realizing, what's going on out here, in the South Pacific and the South Atlantic, which is kind of funny to think given the challenges in communications technology at that time. But Churchill takes it on the chin in this story. Can you talk a little bit about that, what the disconnect was at the Admiralty? Because I have my own theories on what was going on with Churchill at that time. I'd like to hear yours.
Sure, that's has been a subject of great debate for more than a century now. That Churchill is rightfully lauded as one of the great saviors of Western civilization in his ability to turn back the Nazi tide in the Second World War. But in the First World War, he had a different role, and
it was a work in progress.
It was a work in progress, and his he certainly didn't have the ultimate authority that he would have had later on. But part of it, I think, was the blinders that were an inherent part of the Royal Navy's dominance and the British Empire's dominance at the time. As noted, I think in the afterword in this book, the British loss at Coronel was the first naval loss that the Royal Navy had suffered in more than a century. And on
Since
some
the War of
level,
1812, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the Battle of Lake Champlain was the last time they had, which is a completely different era of in every possible way of naval combat. And I think in some ways it was almost inconceivable for the Royal Navy to think that they could be bested by a rival in a open fight like this. And I think that blinded them a little bit. And it also, and there were two things. One, it was that idea that, this couldn't possibly happen. But the other part of it was the greater threat to British interests was the German, home fleet. I mean, the fleet that was actually moored in German waters, just across the English Channel, just a few hundred miles away. That was there was an immense German fleet right there. And I think that many of the decisions that went into the lack of support that went into the British interests that were patrolling South American waters at the time was the reluctance to pull away capital ships and more powerful assets from protecting British home waters. And so the first ships that were sent to support Luce in South America were cast-offs from the reserve fleet.
Yeah.
They were not ships that were state-of-the-art. In many cases, they were, more liabilities than they were assets. And so I think those two factors, this sort of inconceivable notion that the Royal Navy could lose an actual battle in open waters, and then the idea that their real priority was protecting British interests at home, factored into what ultimately was the decision not to really support this group enough that they could overwhelm the British at Coronel, the Germans at Coronel, excuse me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I also think that if you go back and look at the history of Churchill and his decision making, especially in World War I, he had a habit of ignoring advice from his underlings. He slowly was able to chip away at that to where, once he was prime minister in World War II, he could take advice. But you really do see it, and you see it at Gallipoli in 1915.
Right.
He just did not really take the advice of his underlings and make it into policy or strategy or tactics, really until the 1940s. And I think that this book, again shows that tendency that led to Gallipoli a year later.
Right. No, you're absolutely right. I think that those, and Gallipoli certainly in terms of the blotches, the few blotches on Churchill's record, Gallipoli is the bigger one.
Yeah.
That is certainly more well known. But Cornell was really the first significant one, and that was really, there were, as I tried to convey in the novel, there were so many opportunities that they had to potentially change that narrative. They knew really kind of what was going on. They at least have a pretty good idea, but were just so reluctant to commit better resources and greater resources to the task. And the result was, I mean, a shocking circumstance. I mean, it really was a shocking scenario for Britain. It was a celebratory circumstance for Germany. In fact, the cover image on the novel, the Wolves and the Greyhounds. I mean, I actually have it right here, but this particular picture is from a German postcard that was printed in 1914 to commemorate the German victory at Cornell.
Wow. And
so it was a celebratory thing back home, to the point where they actually were printing up. It was a huge thing. It was massive, as you can imagine, headlines on newspapers, but they also and so I was able to get a licensed a license to use this image from a stock image that has been sitting around for more than a century, and that's so we were able to modify it for this cover. But it was a huge deal, both this shocking defeat for the British, but also this amazing victory over the great British Empire for the Germans. And in many ways, it kind of validated everything that Admiral von Tirpitz had been doing to build up the German Navy, and it was this kind of example of the rise of the Kaiser and everything else. It was a huge boost to German morale. That at the beginning of the war the outcome was by no means decided at that point. I mean,
right.
At the time of these events, Germany was making great advances both on the eastern and western fronts. And it didn't look like they were going to be turned back anytime soon. Certainly by the end of 1914, some of the Western Front had solidified into a kind of a stalemate, which ultimately would become the narrative for the rest of the war. But it didn't really look that way at the time. And Britain's involvement was still new, and the United States hadn't gotten involved at all at that point. So the outcome of the war was by no means decided, and this was, in many cases, at least from the German perspective, validation that victory was going to be theirs, and that was a very shocking turn of the kind of the global perception of the power of balance in the world.
Yeah, I found this book to be a very good companion to one that I read about a year ago for the first time, which is crazy because it's a classic, but The Guns of August by Barbara Tuchman. It really does cover this period and the unknowns and just how everybody kind of fell ass backward into a world war and then started looking around and saying, well, what do we do now? And the other thing that I found interesting, and you mentioned this in the book, is not only did the British suffer this setback, but they also lost the Goeben and the Breslau in the Mediterranean, which was supposed to be their, basically their swimming pool in their backyard that Great Britain had controlled for hundreds of years. So it really was just a crazy, probably 3 to 4 month period between the declaration of war and then, the Battle of the Falklands that your book ends up with.
Right, and you mentioned the Goeben and Breslau. That's a good example, as was Cornell and then ultimately the Falklands, of how even their rules of engagement were evolving as the war was progressing. Not having fought
which you and I have seen before,
exactly,
in different circumstances.
Absolutely, and so it was a huge disgrace for to lose Goeben and Breslau to the Ottoman Turks. And that really, as you know, as the book kind of alludes to, really changed the way, or at least sort of steered the way that Craddock approached the Battle of Coronel. The last thing that Craddock, a proud, career, admiral who he'd been knighted at this point. I mean, he was, one of the kind of the heroes of the Royal Navy at the time. The last thing he was going to be doing is going to run from a fight, even a fight that he couldn't possibly win.
Right.
And that was part of the problem. And so that previous event right at the beginning of the war, really changed a lot of, opinions about it. I mean, having someone court-martialed because they declined to fight a battle they couldn't win, that, was a huge event. And I think that, they were learning on the fly and figuring out what to do. And again, it goes back to this idea that it was inconceivable that the Royal Navy would ever, not only lose, but even turn away from a possible fight. I mean, they were the dominant superpower in the world. And, this idea that they, wouldn't engage an enemy was just so far-fetched that it really, I think blinded a lot of people to some of the realities of the world at the time.
Yeah, I kept thinking of two books while I was reading yours. The Guns of August was one of them, but the other was Master and Commander.
Oh yeah.
And I don't know if there's a better compliment to give someone who just wrote historical fiction than to compare them to Patrick O'Brian. But those books, much like yours, very technical, very technically correct. Very well researched, obviously. I mean, that guy was kind of kooky in that he literally tried to live that lifestyle, and speak the way they spoke in the 1800s. And I don't think he went quite that far.
No, I was absolutely not.
You're still married. That tells me you didn't go that far.
Exactly. I do like an occasional rum ration, but beyond that, no.
But yeah, I kept thinking of that style of book, that type of book, and it really showed just how much research you had put into it and just how much you made yourself be a subject matter expert in World War I naval matters.
Right, which I certainly had not expected to, all of the things I would have expected to kind of build up some expertise in. That had not been on my bingo card at all. Right. But it's
not exactly, something you would use in the real world.
No, it isn't. And other than to write a book, it gets published in the real world. But you're right. That was fascinating for me to learn so much about that period of time, and that was sort of a fascinating part of it as well for me, is to focus on the technologies of the time, and some of their kind of extraordinary advances and some of their just crippling limitations. And the fact that these, not only did the commanders and their vessel, but entire units of multiple ships being able to navigate under these circumstances, under terrible weather conditions, and without any kind of command and control connection to the back home, without any radar, without any of the things that we would consider modern advances, certainly a century before GPS, this idea that you could actually not only navigate globally with extraordinary accuracy, but then engage and fight a battle against a foe that is trading blows with you at 6-7 mile distance. I mean, and actually hit your targets. I mean, that was amazing to me. And so that the more I read about it, it was just fascinating that they could do this. And this is another talk, in terms of technology. It was really sort of the end of the era of ships slugging it out with guns against each other too. I mean, by the time we got to the Second World War,
the aircraft carriers coming, and that makes pretty much all of these ships obsolete in one form or another.
Oh, exactly. I mean, most of the naval battles in the Second World War were decided by aircraft
Yeah.
at great distances. 60 miles away, your planes are dropping, bombs and torpedoes on their ships.
You're welcome, everybody.
And so that, that was a huge fundamental change. So this era really represented the end of that idea. Certainly ships slug it out with each other now, but they're using missiles to do it. And
yeah, and if they are using guns, that's all computer generated. All those firing solutions are not in the hands of the gunnery operator. That's computers, and that did not exist in 1914.
Exactly. And so, the idea that you'd be at this distance of, let's say, 4 or 5 miles away,
Yeah.
and your ship fires the first salvo, and the spotters are actually watching to see where those shells land.
Yeah.
Oh, you've shot long, and then they're actually manually cranking those guns down so that they get, and all of this is happening while shells are incoming, while you're navigating in 12-foot seas or whatever it might be. That was just a crazy circumstance for them to be, and the fact that they were able to do it. So that was another fascinating thing for me, is to really.
Well, and I love that this is going to get a little bit into the literary weeds, but I love the way you paced that in the book. Like the way you write your battle scenes. There's a difference from when you are writing about a shore visit where they're talking to the local folks from the embassy. That's a different writing style than you use when you go into battle. And what that does for the reader is you get this this idea that you're kind of language, you're relaxed when you're not in battle, but when you're in battle, it's super tense. I don't know if that was on purpose, the way you wrote that.
It was
because it was really well done.
No, I appreciate that.
And that having been on a deployment and gone into combat, it's exactly the way the world works. Your typical naval deployment is 99% boredom and 1% pure terror. And I think that you really did capture that with the way you wrote your battle scenes.
No, I appreciate that. Thank you. Yeah, I was trying to do that not just in pace, but also with perspective. So most of the book is an alternating chapter format, where one chapter is told mostly from the British perspective, the next chapter is mostly told from the German perspective. But in any of the areas where it becomes a battle, that is exchanged for a section alternation. So within the same chapter, you have a section that might be 6 paragraphs or 3 pages or whatever it might be, that's British, followed by a German, followed by a British. And so that the pacing picked up then as well, just in the exchange of perspectives, because things happen so rapidly in a battle scenario that there simply wasn't the luxury from a storyteller's perspective of being able to stay on one side of the story. It had to be exchanged back and forth between them. And so that was, it was intentional, and it was also meant to be, structurally significant, so that the reader is getting both sides of the story, in real time as much as possible.
How'd you learn to do that?
I don't know. I think I just decided that was the best way to do it. I think that I determined that, because, partly, and this is going to sound, perhaps, unusual to someone who hasn't written a book, to those people who haven't written a book out there, but writing a book in a lot of ways is like reading a book, in that you even as the author don't always know what's going to happen next. You're on your own path as you're writing it. And even though I wrote this novel to mirror actual events, and so I certainly had this broader structure of historical timeline that I could use as this, greater guide for how things happened and when they happened. Most of what happened in between, I would have to, fill in the blanks.
Sure.
And so there were a lot of things where I had to take creative license and kind of work through it. And so as part of that process in writing it, I would I was writing a chapter from the British perspective and a chapter from the German perspective, and as the writer, I was, I would write the German part of it, and then I would be itching to get back to the British part of it and tell the next story. And it was compelling to me to want to get to that next phase and write the next, push the story along in this next area. And as part of that, in the battle scenes, which were certainly a lot of fun to write, it was also I was almost throwing the words down on the page as quickly as I could because I was so excited about doing it, and going back and forth between the two sides, or and it's more than just two sides because the perspectives go from ship to ship to ship to ship. And so sometimes you're looking at one vessel and it's a German vessel, the next one it's a British vessel, but then next one you go back to a different German vessel because so many things are happening at once. It was exciting for me to want to do that. And so partly it was part of the writing journey. It almost compelled me to do it as well, because I was so excited about, okay, well, I know this is also happening at the same time, but I have to tell that from this other perspective. And this is what they're seeing. And especially in the Battle of the Falklands, some of what you see is you get observers who aren't engaged in the actual combat watching what's happening to their compatriots half a mile away, and unlike Coronel, where the circumstances were so, the visibility was terrible and it was nighttime and everything else, the Falklands battle happened in broad daylight on a clear day with calm seas, and so you could see for miles without any visibility problems. And so in a lot of cases, they're actually watching what's happening to their fellow sailors on ships that are not part of their battle right now. And so that was fun for me to write as well. The difference between being in it and watching it from afar, that juxtaposition was a fun thing to write.
Yeah, I wanted to talk a little bit about that battle because obviously I didn't know about the Battle of Coronel. And I had no idea that the Germans tried to invade the Falklands during World War I. So thank you for enlightening me. But I was struck by, and I don't know how much of this was artistic license and how much was actual history. Maybe you can talk a little bit about it. But I was struck by just how, as the Germans are approaching the Falklands, how many warning signs there are that they're walking into something they don't think they're walking into, but they just willfully ignore. And, I wrote down, I read your book on Kindle, and I made a note of confirmation bias. Right. As they're steaming towards, this supposedly unoccupied area, and they see the smoke in the distance, and they go, oh, they're burning their coal stores. And I went, wow. we really do, as human beings, see what we want to see. Was that part of the history? Does that come through in your sources?
Yeah, that was part of the history. Now, in terms of the sources on the German side, more of that was lost to circumstance and time than the British, kind of archival information. However, the second in command of SMS Gneisenau, Hochhammer, who is, portrayed in the book as this sort of wild, kind of reactionary, very emotional kind of person. That may not do him justice, but he wrote a memoir a few years after the fact, in the early 20s. He wrote a memoir that I was fortunately able to get a copy of, and it was extraordinary. And so his account of these events is really the only surviving one that goes beyond the Battle of Coronel, because everything else in terms of ship's logs and all of those things, all that went down with the ships.
Right.
And so that was a huge influence on sort of like how the Germans perceived this. And there are also, there are some other, sources from, that preceded Coronel that survived because, officers sent letters home and, that type of thing. So I was able to get all of that. But it is actually absolutely true that the the Germans had already seen this happen in Tahiti. They had seen the French burning their coal stocks to keep them from being captured.
Right.
And as a deterrent, like, why would you bother coming here? Just take our coal. We're just burning it anyway. We're going to cut off our nose to spite our face just to keep you from invading. And so they'd actually seen it before. And then part of it was, and this is some conjecture, some artistic license. There is some question as to just how altogether was von Spee at the end. He was showing signs of.
Yeah, you hinted that. You hinted that in the book.
Yeah, and so was he, was he all there? I mean, was he? How focused was he on really getting home? How focused was he obsessed with this idea of taking the Falklands? Those two things, as pointed out to him by his staff, some of his staff, were potentially contradictory. I mean, you can do one or the other. We can either get ourselves home, or we can try to take this piece of British soil in the South Atlantic. And if we do one, we won't be able to do the other.
Right.
And he really seemed driven to pursue this almost at all costs. And you talk about this confirmation bias, this idea that they saw what they saw and first of all thought it was something else, but then this idea again that it was inconceivable that the British would divert capital ships to this remote outpost.
Yeah,
that was unheard of. It's simply, they never sent battleships or battle cruisers out beyond, British waters. Those were, protecting the British Isles. That's what their job was. And the idea that battle cruisers would be sent to this remote spot was just unheard of. And so partly it was a circumstance that had never happened before, but also partly it was something that we really want to do this anyway, so we can sort of take all these warnings that might be something else.
Right.
We should we can just ignore those because it's inconvenient.
It's also kind of the sunk cost fallacy. Well, we're already here. We're already at the mouth of the bay. We might as well keep going.
Right, exactly. And they had no idea that this overwhelming force had been assembled to destroy them. And unfortunately for them, on that particular day, the weather and the circumstances really prevented them from escaping from when they finally realized, oh wow, we have really stepped in it. This is, we're out of our depth now. They couldn't then get away. Had that been almost any other day in that particular part of the world, they probably would have had a squall or a rain shower or fog or stormy seas or something, and they probably could have gotten away. But not that day, and it was just the worst possible set of circumstances for them, and they just blundered right into it.
Yep. I wanted to back up a little bit. You mentioned the philosophy of writing. My writing coach, when I first started, her philosophy, her saying that got drilled into my head was, write the book that only you can write.
Yes. And
based on what I know of your history, you wrote the book that only you could write, because I notice as I go through it, there is a fair component of the Foreign Service, the folks in port who are, talking to the captains and servicing the ships and helping them out and collecting intelligence along the way. So that definitely showed through, once I had read your full biography, I realized, okay, well, he knows a fair amount about this Foreign Service thing, having grown up in a Foreign Service family and then serving in the CIA. Do you really, I guess I'm kind of teeing this question up for you, which is, how did that influence your writing? Did you feel like you needed to put a character in there who was in the Foreign Service, or did it just naturally come together for you?
Well, I thought it was an important part of the story. There was a character who essentially was like Minister Robertson, who did in fact help out the Glasgow in that particular circumstance. But to your point, I certainly had lived this life of being overseas. I grew up overseas. I was, my father was in the Foreign Service, and so my childhood was spent in some other foreign country somewhere.
Yeah.
And for example, I can remember when I was in high school, I was living in Thailand at the time, and I was going to
which I think is super cool.
It was cool. It was an amazing childhood. It really, really was. And there was it was not uncommon to have because it was a multicultural, multinational school, this international school, Bangkok, in Bangkok, Thailand. There were festivals from all kinds of places all over the world for the people who were there. And in the summertime, on 4th of July, they would do at the school this big 4th of July celebration for the Americans who were there, and like the Marine Corps Color Guard from the embassy would come out, and they would play music, and they would have sack races, and just kind of a fun event. And a lot of the Americans there who were associated with the embassy in one fashion or another, State Department, would be out there. And for me, it was a totally different experience to be on the other side of the world in a foreign country, listening to the national anthem being played.
Yeah,
and that was this kind of this patriotic moment, realizing you're detached from your home country and how that connection mattered. And so, in this book, I did want to emphasize how much it mattered that both the Germans and the British were able to make these connections when they were the rare times they were in port, the rare times they could talk to a consular officer and get whatever scraps of intelligence they could, because that was really their only opportunity to do so. And it was dangerous for them while they were there to be in this place, because for every moment they're there, somebody knows they're there and could potentially be converging on them from somewhere else. And so those little tastes of home, like when the Germans are able to kind of celebrate in Coronel after the battle, and there's German beer halls, and this German music they can listen to, and all of that meant an immense amount to them, to be so far away from home and not know whether they would ever make it home, but have this little taste of home there. So I definitely wanted to insert that into the story as much as I could.
Interesting. I think of when you mention that, I think about port calls in Bahrain, where they would set up American restaurants in the sandbox, just to give you that taste of home that you've been missing for the last 4, 5, 6 months.
No, absolutely.
Cool. What else from your history did you pull into this book?
Well, partly I wanted to be able to sort of tell this story in a way that hopefully allowed the readers to experience it as much as possible from a perspective that they probably had never seen before. That you mentioned sort of the beginning, that you learned some things you didn't know before. Well, I did too. And so for me, all that stuff that I learned that was just fascinating to me, even though I had this, experience as a military analyst and an intelligence community, and I lived overseas, and I've done all these things that, I've been on naval warships, and I've, been involved in combat situations. All of this stuff, helps, to give yourself the perspective and that you want to be able to tell a story as realistically as possible. Mm-hmm. And some of that is this granular detail about, how tedious it is to fuel a coal-fired steamship or whatever. I mean,
not only that, but talk about the parrots.
Oh yeah, the birds. Okay, so that was a real thing. I just had to put that in there.
You couldn't make that up.
I couldn't possibly make that up. It was absolutely a real thing, and partly that was based on the fact that Glasgow was scheduled to be, they were homeward bound. And
Yeah,
so,
that killed me. That part of the book where they've been at sea for, what was it, almost a year?
yeah,
And they get to Rio and war is declared. And guess what, kids? We're jumping back on the boat and getting after
exactly.
it.
But at this point, a whole bunch of those sailors had bought these birds,
Yeah.
These parrots that they're going to take home. And, and so they were literally in cages all over the ship. And they just said, okay, fine, we're going to keep them. We can't get rid of them anyway. And and it's actually true that as the beginning of the Battle of Coronel was starting, there was a request brought up to the bridge that if they could release the birds in advance of the battle, not knowing whether or not they would survive. And so I just had to put that detail in there. And so it's just those types of things are just gems from the past that I just couldn't not convey that. And even though it's not a substantive part of the story, but it was this kind of detail that really makes it so much more human that these people did this. It's such a real thing that people would do.
Yeah, super cool. Obviously it stuck with me. So what are you working on next?
I'm working on. I've actually got two things in the works right now. One is a sister story to The Wolves and the Greyhounds, which is and so that one I'm working on right now. So we'll see. It's not a sequel. It's not a prequel. It's just sort of a story that happens at the same period of time. Again, all of this research shouldn't go for nothing, right?
Yeah, I was just going to say, don't let all that time go to waste. You might as well.
Right. But I'm also working on a more modern thriller that has echoes of military history, and so that one is really kind of front burner right now, and that one is more. That one's going to take place where I actually currently live right now. So I live in Tennessee, and so that one is but it's a more modern, again, sort of thriller, again with some elements of military history. I don't want to reveal too much at this point, but but yeah, that one's kind of fun, and I'm working on that one. Hopefully, we'll see. That one will be ready around before this time next year. But that's what I'm working on right now.
Very cool. All this with a wife, kids, full-time job, and trying to get some woodworking in as well, I understand.
Exactly. Well, the kids are grown now. I mean, them being in high school was long enough ago now that they're all grown adults with their own lives. But yes, otherwise, full-time job and wife and pets and just regular life going on.
Well, very cool. I think you nailed it. Really enjoyed the book. And it was great to hear your take on some of these things today to get a little bit more background. And I know I'll be looking forward to the next project.
Well, I'll certainly let you know, but I really appreciate the time. Thank you very much. This was a lot of fun.
Yeah, very fun. Thanks, Bob.
Okay. Thank you, Patrick.
Here are 3 lessons for the modern investor from Robert Schreiner's The Wolves and the Greyhounds. Number 1, technology changes quickly, and that is a good thing. Economists use the production possibilities frontier graph to state the relationship between resource usages. Well, research shows that technology moves the production possibility frontier outward, creating a general increase in economic activity. Professors from MIT, Stanford, and Northwestern analyzed 85 years of patents, and they determined that technology boosts overall wealth and total productivity. Over time, the aggregate economy expanded as technology progressed, even though everyone was worried about whatever new technology was going to take over their jobs. Negative opinions about technological advance are broadcast far and wide these days via television, the internet, and social media. Ironic, because none of them existed 100 years ago when we first started to fear the effects of technology. People, don't fear the machines. Lesson number 2. Unlike that German fleet steaming toward the Falkland Islands, investors must avoid confirmation bias, which is a term introduced by English psychologist Peter Wasson, referring to the inclination of individuals to prioritize information that aligns with, reinforces, or validates their existing beliefs. Once established, confirmation bias becomes entrenched and is challenging to dislodge. and it shapes how individuals perceive and interpret any new information. But it's even harder these days thanks to social media and the algorithms that show you more of what you like, hopefully like this show, and less of what you don't. Because of that, we are living in the golden age of confirmation bias. Lesson number 3, learn to take advice and avoid the sunk cost fallacy. First Lord of the Admiralty, Winston Churchill, was known to often go against the advice of his chiefs of staff. Now, in the case of the Gallipoli campaign, he committed more and more assets and lives to an unwinnable cause. Driven by his emotions and his passions, he continued to commit forces when it was clear the objective wasn't reachable. That's the fallacy of sunk cost. Just because you have committed heavily to an investment does not mean that abandoning it altogether might not be the prudent course. Sunk cost fallacy is sticking with something just because you've already invested time or money in it, even if it's not working out. Remember, what's done is done. Make decisions based on what's best now, not what effort or money you've already put in. Well, my fellow historians, that is all for this episode. Be sure to pick up Robert's book on Amazon and visit his website, robertschreiner.com. And while you are on Amazon, feel free to check out my book as well, History Lessons for the Modern Investor. And be sure to do all the social stuff. Like this episode, follow us wherever you see or hear your podcasts. We're available on Substack, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or YouTube. Until next time, we'll take another rollicking romp through the past and make an investment in your future with history lessons for the modern investor. Goodbye, everybody.